Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Dear oh dear, Joyce, where does he go from here? So in this video, we'll discuss some of what went wrong in his fight with Derek Chisora and also the potential what next, because he's cut off some avenues with this loss to Derek Chisora. This was a fight that Joyce should have won. He could have won. He had the physical advantages, but often he didn't choose to use them. So his career path looks like it's going to go on a very different trajectory than he was expecting heading into this one. And I've seen some people say that Chisora, this wasn't an upset for Chisora, that he was going to win this fight, but, the bookies had Joyce to win. A lot of people had Joyce to win. At 40 years old and faded from his prime, Derek Chisora, we know what he is, and he's even faded from his best as a gatekeeper. But on this one, he kept the gate closed, and let's face it, Joyce allowed him to in some respects. And we'll talk about those, and as I say, we'll talk about the what next. I mean, one of the things that I couldn't believe, and in my preview video, a lot of people left comments saying, look, if Joyce wants to use his jab and basically just pick off Derek Chisora, he can win this in a canter. But he didn't choose to do that. For the most part, Joyce didn't use his advantages. He's 4.5 inches taller with a 6-inch reach advantage. He really couldn't make that count for the most part. There were patches where he was boxing long and he looked like, he was pretty comfortable in that space. He was having success, but he was opting to collapse the space between the two, try to press forward, especially after the first couple of rounds. Early on, you had Chisora pressing forward, but then Joyce tried to basically step forward, lean on Chisora. He was collapsing the space, and he was fighting at Chisora's preferred range a lot of the fight. And with his leaky defense, Chisora was winging in shots both to body and both to head, and given Joyce doesn't have a huge amount of head movement at times, he was taking some big shots, right hands, right hooks. You had huge left hooks coming in as well, and some of these were shaking up Joyce to some extent, stopping his advance and sometimes giving him pause for thought. And the jab was especially inconsistent. And Joyce does have a decent jab if he chooses to use it. So I don't know what the instruction was in the corner, or whether he couldn't follow it, or whether, and you step back and go, we know what Derek Chisora does. Effectively the way that Chisora fought in this fight is the way that he's fought in many of his fights. He does certain things, and Joyce played right into his hands. He fought at Chisora's preferred range, in this sort of range that, that was really only Chisora's route to victory. Tyson Fury kept him on the end of a jab in that third fight and made him look a little bit silly. He didn't win a second of that fight, essentially. But apart from the jab, you had a situation where Joyce couldn't get into Juggernaut mode properly. And think about peak Juggernaut mode. That's probably 2022, and I've actually discussed some of Joyce's career, especially the burn bright, fade fast element, in a video that I've just put up on Patreon. So you can sign up as a member and check that one out at your leisure. So he couldn't get into Juggernaut mode properly. He had Chisora on the brink a few times in round 8 and round 9. And let's face it, in round 10, Chisora was trying to avoid Joyce as much as possible. He was trying to just stay out of the way and fight it on his terms. And as it was, he landed some telling shots in that round when he decided to throw. But Joyce, a big part of that, why he couldn't get him out of there, he couldn't get into Juggernaut mode properly, and part of that is he came in heavy. He came in overweight, 281 pounds. And I called this after the weigh-in in my preview video, saying it was a red flag. And against Cash Ali, he really couldn't get into Juggernaut mode. That was a warm-up. Sure, he might have wanted rounds, but he never seemed to quite, get right into it like the way he has in the past. And same here. Actually, after about 6 or 7 rounds, I'm sure many of you noticed that even Joe Joyce was blowing a little bit heavy. He didn't seem to, have as much of that engine that we've seen in the past. He looked a bit gassed after those 6 or 7 rounds, and I fully believe because he came in at 281 pounds was a big part of the reason he couldn't quite get off his volume game. Joe Joyce's best defense in his career has proven to be throwing a lot of punches. Sure, he might have been outworking Derek Chisora in this fight. That's not a huge surprise because Chisora doesn't exactly work as a massive volume puncher at times. But you had Joyce not quite being able to get into that juggernaut mode, and part of that was the weight because he was tired and he couldn't throw as much and he wasn't being as effective. And a Joe Joyce who's not fully in a juggernaut mode as he's been in the past is a much more hittable and beatable fighter. He was more hittable in this fight. We already know Joe Joyce sometimes can look slow as molasses, and if he's, his head is there, he's not getting it off the line, and Chisora's winging in big shots, a lot more eye-catching than the work Joyce is throwing. The judges were swayed by that, clearly. I've seen some people saying that this was not an upset, but look, Joyce was the favourite going in with the bookies. Chisora, 40 years old, significantly faded from his prime, and let's face it, Joe Joyce couldn't finish him off. It's not a great look. He lost this one, and his stock falls massively as a result. And then you have to go, well, what happens next? I still believe he was one of the better heavyweights floating around in the division in 2022. There was a period where he peaked, and that peak came with the Parker victory. And I do believe he has fallen off some. Some of that, I think, is down to the losses to Zhang. I think that's taken something from him. But you also have to view the punishment as a whole. Guys were teeing off on him like Christian Hammer, Carlos Takam, Joseph Parker. I think we all remember after a lot of fights saying Joe Joyce has no defense and it's a red flag. And this red flag has come to fruition in this fight as well as some others. But I think an aging fighter at now 38, he hasn't been able to whip himself into the sort of shape that he's been in the past. He hasn't gotten into juggernaut mode as he has in the past. And Derek Chisora's taken this one for him. Not only that, he dropped him in the fight. Joyce couldn't finish him off. I think if people are saying that Joyce hasn't fallen off some from what I would consider his prime, then I think you're kidding yourselves. Joyce at 281 is not the optimal weight for him. He's much better at 10 or 15 pounds lighter. But even at the 10 or 15 pounds lighter, maybe he's not going to be the fighter that he once was. And after the fight, you had Frank Warren, when he was asked about the what next for both of it, he was a little bit iffy on the what next, talking about the punishment that both of them had taken.
That was a brutal fight, and those fights do, at the end of the day, they will catch up with you. So you've got to think about it.
And when your promoter is a little bit iffy, that's not a great sign. And you have to ask now, after losing to Chisora, who's a gatekeeper, at best at this point, is he going to be settling in at a lower level himself now? Is he going to become more of a gatekeeper? Was that a passing of the torch from Chisora? Are we now talking about Joe Joyce, because of this loss and settling in at a lower level? Maybe he will need some sort of tune-up, but at this point, how many tune-ups is going to be of any value? He is what he is at this point, unless he can recapture something. And I believe the only way to do that is maybe lose a little bit of beef, from his fight weight. 281 is too much. But even at 265 or 270, there or thereabouts, what has been taken from him? What damage has he sustained, not only from this fight against Chisora, but many others? What did Zhang Zhilei take from him? And it could be quite a bit. I did have a question about, was there a rematch clause with Chisora? Because that didn't seem to be an immediate consideration in the post-fight. I was wondering, well, why was there no immediate talk of a rematch? Chisora was talking about a December card. Has his management missed a trick here with Chisora, or potentially will he just not choose to take a rematch? Or was it a case it was a take it or leave it type of fight? And one thing as well, this was a 10-round fight. Why wasn't it 12? Why didn't they get some sort of trinket on the line? Did Chisora in the negotiation say, no, it has to be 10? Because Chisora wasn't going another couple of rounds, I don't believe. Joe Joyce could have potentially taken this if it had been a 12-round fight. Chisora was gassed after about 4 rounds, hanging in, and landing, in between bouts of, Joyce trying to put it on him. He'd rip in some shots, but he was consistently inconsistent with some of his output. But he was having that success periodically because Joyce couldn't keep him, those shots away. He couldn't avoid some of the big shots from Chisora, which were helping Chisora win rounds because of good little spurts. So what next for Joe Joyce? Chisora rematch? Are we talking about he's going to enter on a Saudi card, but maybe not as a co-main event or in a big fight? Is he going to be a B-side against an up-and-coming heavyweight? You have to ask that question. Would he Agit Kabayel versus Joe Joyce? Is there a rematch potentially with Parker on the cards? Those are a couple of potential big fights, but perhaps after this, is he more going to be dropping down a level? Are we now talking about Fraser Clark or Fabio Wardley being the sort of fights that are, at least for now, the appropriate level of fight for Joyce to re-enter in at? I mean, it's a question. Peak Joe Joyce, I think, was building up to 2022, had that Parker win. I think that was the zenith of his career, and it's kind of been a little bit downhill since. There were some red flags in the Cash Ali tune-up. Didn't look great. It was pretty underwhelming, and he's underwhelmed here. Couldn't finish Chisora off and got dropped. That cost him, and it being 10 rounds probably cost him as well as being overweight because he looked tired at times. He couldn't juggernaut mode, and a Joe Joyce that can't quite juggernaut the same as he did, much more beatable. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.